When she reaches out after weeks of silence, the first thing that stirs inside you isn't logic, it's emotion. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's a shot of adrenaline, maybe it's resentment or longing or that peculiar ache that only she could ever stir up in you. And there it is. Your instinct wants to respond right now, immediately, like it's a test you have to pass, a game you have to win, a signal you must decode. But that instinct, if left unchecked, can lead you right back into patterns that you've worked so hard to escape. So the first thing you must do is nothing. Not because you're cold or indifferent, but because you're intentional. Growth isn't loud. It doesn't always show up in declarations or in clever replies. It shows up in restraint, in that pause before the reply, in that silence where you ask yourself, what do I actually want? You don't owe anyone your immediate attention, especially someone who disappeared when your heart was still wide open. If she waited weeks to reach out, you have every right to take your time now. This is no longer about reacting, it's about reflecting. You've got to understand something fundamental here. People who exit your life without clarity often return with confusion, not closure. And that confusion is contagious if you're not centered. She might not even fully know why she's reaching out. Maybe it's guilt, maybe it's loneliness, maybe it's the sting of realizing the silence she expected you to break never came. But whatever the reason, it's not your job to give immediate answers or emotional relief. It's your job to protect the ground you've gained. Think about who you were when the silence began. Were you confused, hurt, wondering what went wrong? Did you spend sleepless nights refreshing your messages or staring at the phone, replaying conversations, blaming yourself, doubting your worth? And now that the storm has settled a bit, now that you're starting to rebuild, you're being pulled back toward the eye of it. That's not a coincidence. Often when someone senses that their absence didn't break you the way they hoped, they reach out not to reconnect in a meaningful way, but to regain emotional access. And emotional access is everything. Once someone has it, they can shift your focus, alter your mood, steal your peace. And they don't even have to be present to do it. A simple hey can pull your mind into hours of overthinking. A vague message like, been thinking of you, can undo weeks of clarity if you're not grounded. So before you touch that screen, before you even craft a mental reply, ask yourself, am I responding to her or to the version of her I wish existed? And that question, when asked sincerely, can save you. Because we often don't respond to the person in front of us. We respond to the hope we had, the future we imagined, the apology we never got but keep waiting for. And if she returns without new behavior, without genuine accountability, then she's not returning at all. Only her echo is. And engaging with an echo never leads to anything real. It only traps you in a loop. This moment, her reaching out, it tests you. Not to see if you still care, not to see if you still want her, but to see if you've finally learned how to care for yourself more, to see if your healing is stronger than your habits, to see if the silence taught you how to respond like a man who's been through the fire and now walks forward, not backward. Let her message sit. Let your feelings surface and pass. Let the urgency dissolve. Then, and only then, choose what to do. Not based on emotion, but based on values. Based on the clarity you earned in her absence. That is what strength looks like. That is what self-respect sounds like. And that right there is how you stop the cycle from repeating. The moment you stop reacting and start reflecting is the moment you take your power back. When she reaches out after weeks of silence, the second thing you have to confront, beyond the emotions and the memories, is the intent behind the message. Not just the words she sends, but the motivation behind them. Because the surface is always too easy to misread. A simple, hey, how have you been, might sound warm, familiar. It might remind you of better days. But don't get caught in the trap of nostalgia. Instead, ask yourself, why now? Timing speaks volumes. People don't randomly reappear. Often it happens when something shifts, not necessarily in their heart, but in their life. Maybe the attention they were getting elsewhere dried up. Maybe the people who replaced you didn't offer the depth or care you used to provide. Or maybe, just maybe, they expected you to chase, to beg, to check in, and your silence disrupted that plan. That's a moment that disturbs their sense of control. And so when they return, it's not always about reconnection, it's about regaining influence. You have to see the pattern. People who leave without closure tend to return without accountability. It's a dangerous game. They show up acting like no time has passed, like the emotional damage didn't happen, like the silence wasn't deafening. And they'll talk in riddles. They'll send vague messages, hint at missing you, reference old memories, but they won't address the truth. They won't say, I hurt you, I left you confused, I knew you cared and I walked away. Because if they acknowledge that, they lose the upper hand. So instead, they test the waters. And if you bite, if you respond eagerly, if you go back without caution, they know they still have access. This is where most people fall. They mistake attention for intention. But attention isn't affection. Attention isn't commitment. It's often just an emotional impulse. And if you've grown, if you've taken time to rebuild yourself during her silence, then you cannot afford to mistake a flicker of her curiosity for genuine change. And here's something that's hard to admit. Part of you probably still wants the message to mean something. We're wired to search for significance in the people who hurt us most, because if there's a meaning behind the pain, we can make sense of it. But sometimes there is no deeper meaning, just impulse, just emotional hunger dressed up as interest. And if you don't pause to examine her intent, you'll find yourself back in a place where your peace depends on her mood, where your sense of worth hinges on whether she stays. This is where discernment becomes more powerful than desire. You can desire her. You can even miss her. But you have to step back far enough to ask, is this reaching out an act of love, or is it an act of loneliness? Did she grow in this time apart, or is she just circling back because things didn't work out elsewhere? If she couldn't handle your presence when you were all in, why does she deserve access now that you've pulled back? There's no shame in asking those questions. They don't make you cynical. They make you careful. They make you conscious. And the man who thinks before he reacts is far more dangerous than the one who lashes out or falls apart. Your power lies not in how fast you respond, but in how clearly you see the game being played. So, what does genuine intent look like? It comes with vulnerability. It comes with clarity. It comes with an apology that's specific, not vague. It comes with action, not just words. If she really means to reconnect, you won't feel confused. You'll feel understood. You won't have to decode every line. You'll hear the truth in her tone. But if she's just reaching out to soothe herself, to test your emotional temperature, to see if you still bleed when she scratches the wound, then your silence becomes your shield. You can acknowledge the message. You can be kind even. But kindness doesn't require you to reopen doors that nearly destroyed you. You owe yourself the discernment to know the difference between real change and temporary boredom. Between someone who misses you and someone who misses the attention. Because the truth is, if she truly valued what you offered, she wouldn't have waited weeks, she wouldn't have left you in the dark, and if she really wanted a future, she wouldn't return without owning the past. Anything less than that is a distraction. And you're no longer a man who entertains distraction. Protect your peace more fiercely than you chase closure. When she reaches out after weeks of silence, one of the most important things you can do is stay grounded in who you've become during that silence. That's key. Because silence, for all its pain, also creates space. Space for reflection. Space for growth. Space for remembering who you were before all the chaos. Before the emotional highs and lows. Before the mixed signals and the second guessing. And in that space, if you used it well, you likely started to rebuild your confidence, your purpose, your discipline. So now when she reappears, it's not about her, it's about how you respond as the man you are now, not the man you were when she left. That means you don't slip back into old habits. You don't respond immediately just because the message feels familiar. You don't start wondering, what does she want? Why now? With that same emotional vulnerability you had before. Instead, you acknowledge the growth, You remember the emotional clarity you fought for, and most importantly, you stay calm. Because calm is power. Calm is control. Calm is what signals to her, and more importantly to yourself, that you're not desperate for validation. Understand this. Emotional neutrality doesn't mean you don't care. It means you've matured. It means you've gained the capacity to observe your emotions rather than be ruled by them. And that's exactly what you need when someone who once triggered your worst anxieties suddenly reappears. Because her reaching out doesn't erase the distance. It doesn't erase the unanswered questions. It doesn't erase how you had to put yourself back together while she disappeared. This is the moment that tests your inner discipline. It's easy to fall back into emotional engagement, to pick up the conversation where it left off, to believe that maybe this time it'll be different. But what matters now is the strength of your internal foundation. You have to weigh everything against that. Are you responding out of strength, or are you reacting from a place of hope? Because there's a big difference. Hope, when not paired with standards, is dangerous. It blinds you, it makes you ignore red flags, it makes you reinterpret inconsistency as effort. But strength, real strength, sees the full picture. It sees that a late message after weeks of silence isn't an apology. It isn't closure. It isn't even effort unless it's backed up with action. And unless she's showing up with clear intent, with responsibility, with emotional maturity, you owe it to yourself to remain steady. That steadiness. Emotional neutrality isn't passive, it's active. It's a conscious choice. When you're emotionally neutral, you're not being cold, you're being precise, you're being measured. You're choosing not to let someone else's reappearance destabilize the ground you've rebuilt beneath your feet, because you know what it costs to get there. She might test that. She might say things that aim for your soft spots. She might try to reignite that old spark with memories or flirtation or vague affection. But your job is to keep your clarity. Respond if you must, but do it from a position of strength. Respond with calm words, direct tone, and controlled emotion. Let her feel that you've changed, not by telling her, but by showing her that her presence no longer dictates your peace. Because when you're emotionally neutral, you're untouchable in a way that's incredibly disruptive to someone who once controlled you through emotional leverage. She'll notice that you're no longer moved by the same tactics. You're no longer reaching, no longer seeking closure, no longer trying to revive something that was built on imbalance. That in itself becomes your loudest response. It also forces her to reveal her true intent, because if her outreach was about regaining control or soothing her loneliness, she'll likely withdraw again once she realizes she can't affect you like before. But if her outreach was genuine, she'll remain, she'll clarify, she'll engage in honest conversation, and you'll be able to make a decision not from a place of need, but from a place of clarity. This is emotional sovereignty. The ability to engage with someone without giving them the power to undo your progress. The ability to face what once hurt you without flinching. You may still care, you may still feel, but those feelings no longer override your standards. That's when you know you've grown. So when she reaches out, remember, it's not the message that matters most, it's who you've become in her absence. That's your guide, that's your compass. You don't need to react quickly. You don't need to decode her tone or romanticize her words. You only need to listen to yourself. And if the man you've become values peace, clarity, and self-respect above emotional chaos, then respond in a way that protects those things. Because the man who holds his center when she returns is the man who no longer fears losing her when she reaches out after weeks of silence and you're standing there trying to decide what to make of it, what to say, how to feel. There's something critical you must remember. If there was a lack of clarity in the past, and if that silence followed conflict, confusion, or disrespect, then the burden is not on you to make sense of her return. It's on her to bring clarity. And if she doesn't, if she reappears without substance, without acknowledgement of the past, without a sincere explanation, you don't have to engage emotionally, because confusion is not a basis for connection, it's a warning. And someone has gone silent after shared history, after promises or vulnerability, and they come back with vague pleasantries or casual check-ins. That's not connection. That's disruption. That's someone poking at your piece to see if they still hold a piece of your emotional real estate. And if they're reaching out casually after vanishing, it often means they're not prepared to do the emotional work. They're just seeing if the door is still unlocked. And this is where men get trapped. You receive the message, maybe late at night, maybe on a weekend, maybe when you're finally starting to feel normal again, and your mind starts spinning. What does this mean? Does she miss me? Should I say something kind? Should I ignore her? And before you know it, you're back inside the dynamic, not because she gave you clarity, but because she stirred the emotional dust just enough to get your attention. But here's what you need to understand. If someone disrupts your life, then disappears, then comes back without acknowledging that disruption, without asking how you've been or what their absence meant to you or how their silence might have impacted you, they're not reaching out to connect. They're reaching out to relieve their own discomfort. Maybe they feel guilty, maybe they're lonely, maybe they just want to see if they still have you emotionally available in case they need attention. That's not love. That's control. And love without responsibility isn't love. It's manipulation dressed up as concern. So don't fill in the gaps. Don't build a bridge where she's only offering a rope. If she doesn't come with emotional clarity, you don't need to offer her the benefit of the doubt. That's not cold, that's not bitter, that's maturity. Because clarity is a form of respect. If she respected you, your time, your effort, your past investment, she'd come back with an explanation. She'd say what changed. She'd tell you why now. She'd offer insight into what that silence was about. And if she doesn't, then it's not your job to guess. And you have to be careful, because when a man starts interpreting silence or interpreting vague messages, he often starts negotiating against his own standards. He starts saying things like, well, maybe she was overwhelmed, or maybe she needed space, or maybe she was scared. And all of those things might be true, but they don't erase the fact that you were left in emotional limbo, that you had to wonder, that you had to pick yourself up with no explanation, that you had to process uncertainty without partnership. And that matters. So the moment she reaches out, your responsibility is not to decode her. Your responsibility is to protect the man you became in her absence. Because that man learned not to chase ambiguity. He learned not to overextend where there's no clarity. He learned not to treat emotional breadcrumbs like full meals. And if she returns without changed behavior, without emotional intelligence, without humility, then you already have your answer. You see, the version of her that left isn't going to be any different unless she's done real work. And that kind of work is hard. It doesn't happen in silence. It doesn't happen in casual texts. It happens in honesty, in difficult conversations, in a willingness to take accountability. And if she's not willing to do that, then this isn't a new beginning. It's a loop. And you don't need to step back into a loop you've already outgrown. So instead of interpreting her message, interpret her silence. Interpret the time she didn't show up. Interpret the version of yourself you had to build in the quiet. And if you want clarity, then ask for it directly. And if it doesn't come, then don't engage. Because your time, your peace, and your emotional maturity are far too valuable to be spent trying to make sense of someone who couldn't make sense of what you meant when they had you. The right response is measured, controlled, emotionally grounded. You don't need to be cruel. You don't need to prove anything. You only need to remember that the absence of clarity is clarity in itself. When she finally reaches out after weeks of silence, and you're in that moment, faced with the message, the call, the subtle attempt to reopen a line that's been dormant, you have to be acutely aware of one thing. She's testing your emotional availability. Not necessarily because she wants to rebuild what was lost, but because she wants to see if she still has access to it. This is something people rarely talk about, but it's incredibly common. When a person pulls away, cuts off contact, and then suddenly reappears, it's not always about reconnecting. Often it's about reassurance. She wants to know she still matters to you. She wants to know you haven't really moved on. That if she needed your attention, your energy, your affection, you'd still be there, just as available as you were before. And it's in this moment that your reaction becomes more important than her message. See, if you immediately reply with warmth or eagerness or even longing, you're not responding to what is, you're responding to what was. You're responding to the version of her that once made you feel seen, wanted, important, and you're hoping that version is coming back. But that's not discernment. That's nostalgia. And nostalgia is dangerous because it only remembers the best parts of a broken picture. You have to ask yourself, did she reach out because she values me, or because she's curious if she still has emotional control? Because attention is power, and when she had yours, fully, openly, unquestioningly, she knew she could influence your state of mind, and when you withdrew it, even if it was just by default, by protecting yourself from her absence, that power faded. That silence you kept, that stillness you chose, that might have been the first real boundary she ever experienced with you. And that's what brings people back. Not always because they've changed, but because the shift in power dynamics unsettles them. The emotional economy is shifted. You're no longer investing, and they can feel the void where your validation used to be. It bothers them, not because they're prepared to love you properly now, but because they no longer feel in control. And when people lose control over something they took for granted, they often come running, not with humility, but with tactics. That's what these sudden check-ins often are. Tactics, tests, and the way you respond tells her everything she needs to know. If you jump at the chance to reconnect, she knows she still owns a piece of you. If you get emotional, if you question her absence, if you try to get answers that she's not prepared to give, she knows you're still emotionally tied up. But if you respond with calm, measured clarity, if you let her know that her message doesn't disrupt your peace anymore, then the dynamic changes completely. You are no longer the emotionally available man she used to test. You're the grounded man who won't play emotional games anymore. And that's a powerful shift, because when she realizes that her absence didn't destroy you, that it didn't leave you desperate or bitter or clinging, it forces her to see you in a different light, not as the man she left behind, but as the man who no longer waits for half-hearted connection. And here's what's critical. Your self-respect must outweigh your curiosity. You might wonder why she reached out, what her intentions are, if there's still a chance at something real, but your curiosity isn't worth compromising your progress. If she's serious, if she's changed, if she truly wants to rebuild something meaningful, she'll make that crystal clear. She won't play it safe. She won't be vague. She won't reach out to check your temperature. She'll reach out to take accountability and to speak with emotional clarity. And that's what you need to look for. Not effort, but honesty. Not interest, but consistency. Not nostalgia, but growth. Because anyone can miss you. Anyone can get lonely. Anyone can feel regret when the silence stretches too long. But not everyone can change. Not everyone is willing to confront the reasons they walked away. And if she isn't ready to do that, then no amount of attention, no spark of reconnection, no tender memory will be enough to sustain anything real. This is the moment where you define the standard, not just for her, but for yourself. And it comes down to one question. Do I respond to the woman she is right now, or do I react to the woman I remember her to be? Because if you confuse the two, you'll fall back into old patterns. But if you stay grounded in who you've become, then her test becomes your testimony. She may have reached out hoping to find the same man she left, but if you've done the work, if you've found your peace, if you've rebuilt yourself in her absence, then she'll quickly realize he's not there anymore. One of the most powerful yet overlooked elements in this entire situation is your silence. The way you don't respond often says more than anything you could ever write, text, or explain. Because silence isn't just an absence of noise, it's a presence of discipline. And when she reaches out after weeks of nothing, your silence isn't passive, it's deliberate. It communicates something far deeper than anger, neediness, or attachment ever could. You see, people who believe they have unlimited access to you, who assume you'll always be there, emotionally available, ready to respond, are often stunned by your restraint when someone reaches out expecting validation, a reaction, or a return to the emotional dynamic that once gave them control, and they're met with silence. It's not just confusing, it's disarming, because silence forces them to confront themselves. Eventually, it's a mirror, a psychological confrontation. And if you've truly moved beyond their reach emotionally, your silence becomes more than a message, it becomes a boundary, one they can't cross just by showing up unannounced after disappearing. The truth is, most people aren't ready for silence. especially not from someone who used to care. It throws their assumptions into question. It makes them wonder if they misjudged your depth, your patience, your resilience. They assumed you'd be waiting. They assumed your world would still revolve around them, even after they stepped out of it. But silence proves otherwise. Silence shows them you've stepped back into your own center. But here's where it gets even more important. Silence isn't about punishment. It's not about being cold or distant or emotionally unavailable for the sake of ego. It's about clarity. It's about protecting your emotional space from manipulative re-entry attempts that aren't rooted in sincerity or growth. Because when someone leaves without explanation and comes back weeks later without accountability, their return is not a romantic gesture. It's a test, a way to gauge how much of your heart they still control. And if they can't clearly communicate why they left or what's changed, then silence becomes your protection. Think about it. If you respond to every breadcrumb of attention with immediate interest, you're telling her that your emotional doors are always open, no matter how carelessly she walks in or out. But when you withhold that access, when you choose not to answer a message that lacks substance or sincerity, you're saying, I've raised my standard. You're saying, I don't chase uncertainty anymore. And that has more weight than any paragraph of explanation ever could. There's a discipline in silence that forces you to confront your own emotions too. You'll want to respond. You'll feel that familiar pull to reconnect, to say something, anything, because silence feels unnatural when you're used to engaging. But that discomfort, that's growth. That's your psyche realigning itself. You're not ignoring her out of spite. You're respecting yourself enough to wait until the terms of engagement are real, until the connection isn't about ego or power, but mutual understanding. When someone re-enters your life, they should have to meet the new version of you, not the emotionally reactive version they left behind. And the new you doesn't operate out of desperation. He doesn't need constant reassurance. He's not looking for closure in every message. He has clarity. He understands that real connection doesn't start with ambiguity, and it certainly doesn't start with silence followed by vague texts weeks later. Real connection begins with intention, with someone saying, I left, but I've thought deeply about it. Here's why I'm back, and here's what I want to do differently. If she's not saying that clearly, humbly, and with consistency, then there's no reason to reopen that emotional door. You also have to understand that silence doesn't mean inaction. You're not being passive. You're asserting the highest form of emotional control. You're doing the hardest thing, choosing not to indulge a pattern that once brought you pain. That silence is full of strength. It's full of knowing, and it echoes louder in her mind than anything you could have said. Eventually she'll hear it, not just the absence of your voice, but the message within it. She'll hear that you've moved beyond the place where her attention used to hold you hostage. She'll feel that she no longer has the emotional leverage she once enjoyed. And if she ever truly cared, if she's capable of growth, that silence will make her reflect. It will humble her. But if she was only ever looking for control, it will frustrate her. Either way, your silence reveals the truth. And in this world, clarity is more valuable than closure. Let the silence say what words never could. One of the most powerful yet overlooked elements in this entire situation is your silence. The way you don't respond often says more than anything you could ever write, text, or explain. Because silence isn't just an absence of noise, it's a presence of discipline. And when she reaches out after weeks of nothing, your silence isn't passive, it's deliberate. So it communicates something far deeper than anger, neediness, or attachment ever could. You see, people who believe they have unlimited access to you, who assume you'll always be there, emotionally available, ready to respond, are often stunned by your restraint. When someone reaches out, expecting validation or return to the emotional dynamic that once gave them control, and they're met with silence, it's not just confusing, it's disarming. Because silence forces them to confront themselves. It's a mirror, a psychological confrontation. And if you've truly moved beyond their reach emotionally, your silence becomes more than a message, it becomes a boundary, one they can't cross just by showing up unannounced after disappearing. The truth is, most people aren't ready for silence, especially not from someone who used to care. It throws their assumptions into question. It makes them wonder if they misjudged your depth, your patience, your resilience. They assumed you'd be waiting. They assumed your world would still revolve around them even after they stepped out of it. But silence proves otherwise. Silence shows them you've stepped back into your own center. But here's where it gets even more important. Silence isn't about punishment. It's not about being cold or distant or emotionally unavailable for the sake of ego. It's about clarity. It's about protecting your emotional space from manipulative reentry attempts that aren't rooted in sincerity or growth. Because when someone leaves without explanation and comes back weeks later without accountability, their return is not a romantic gesture. It's a test, a way to gauge how much of your heart they still control. And if they can't clearly communicate why they left or what's changed, then silence becomes your protection. Think about it. If you respond to every breadcrumb of attention with immediate interest, you're telling her that your emotional doors are always open, no matter how carelessly she walks in or out. But when you withhold that access, when you choose not to answer a message that lacks substance or sincerity, you're saying, I've raised my standard. You're saying, I don't chase uncertainty anymore. And that has more weight than any paragraph of explanation ever could. There's a discipline in silence that forces you to confront your own emotions too. You want to respond. You'll feel that familiar pull to reconnect, to say something, anything, because silence feels unnatural when you're used to engaging. But that discomfort, that's growth. That's your psyche realigning itself. You're not ignoring her out of spite. You're respecting yourself enough to wait until the terms of engagement are real, until the connection isn't about ego or power, but mutual understanding. When someone re-enters your life, they should have to meet the new version of you, not the emotionally reactive version they left behind. And the new you doesn't operate out of desperation. He doesn't need constant reassurance. He's not looking for closure in every message. He has clarity. He understands that real connection doesn't start with ambiguity, and it certainly doesn't start with silence followed by vague texts weeks later. Real connection begins with intention, with someone saying, I left, but I've thought deeply about it. Here's why I'm back, and here's what I want to do differently. If she's not saying that, clearly, humbly, and with consistency, then there's no reason to reopen that emotional door. You also have to understand that silence doesn't mean inaction. You're not being passive. You're asserting the highest form of emotional control. You're doing the hardest thing, choosing not to indulge a pattern that once brought you pain. That silence is full of strength. It's full of knowing, and it echoes louder in her mind than anything you could have said. Eventually she'll hear it. Not just the absence of your voice, but the message within it. She'll hear that you've moved beyond the place where her attention used to hold you hostage. She'll feel that she no longer has the emotional leverage she once enjoyed. And if she ever truly cared, if she's capable of growth, that silence will make her reflect. It will humble her. But if she was only ever looking for control, it will frustrate her. Either way, your silence reveals the truth. And in this world, clarity is more valuable than closure. Let the silence say what words never could.